The first one being the long telegram. What is it? Why is it important?
Right. So I cheat. I look at our solution for the current fight as being based upon a template that was incredibly successful. And it's two documents from the Cold War, two secret documents that have been declassified, and I actually reproduce in the appendices of the book in their original form. This first one was a very famous secret telegram written by an American diplomat called George Kennan in 1946. He was asked by Washington to explain what's going on in Moscow. Why is Uncle Joe not so friendly anymore? And he sat down. He was an expert on Russian history and the Soviet Union. And he wrote a 14-page telegram that is just superlative. It is the quintessence of what is communism, what is this totalitarian ideology, and why it represents an existential threat to America and to the free world. That's what I call the enemy threat doctrine. That document was later published pseudonymously as the Sources of Soviet Conduct in Foreign Affairs, very famous article in 1947. And then it became the foundation for President Truman's declaration of the Truman Doctrine, that we would help people fighting communism anywhere. And on top of that, here comes the flip side. After the Truman Doctrine was declared, a genius strategist called Paul Nitze in the State Department was tasked by President Truman. Look, here's the enemy. Kennan has described for us the enemy. It's communism, the Soviet Union. Give us a game plan to defeat the Soviet Union. And he wrote the top secret document, National Security Council Memo 68, NSC 68, which again was an incredible strategy for how to destroy the Soviet Union's ideology from the inside and how to strengthen Western civilization. Those two documents, the analysis of the enemy ideology and the game plan on how to delegitimize them, I use that as my template for the current threat, and that's really the meat of my book, Defeating Jihad.
And one of your first points in there was naming the enemy, something that we refuse to do at those high suit levels. Talk to us about some of the points you make in terms of why that's important.
Right. So my game plan for the next president on how to defeat our threat is very simple. It's a three-legged stool. Part one of the plan is get politics out of the threat assessment. No political censorship, no political correctness. If the enemy says they are jihadis, you don't get to change that. You don't get to say, no, they're unemployed, they're uneducated. You don't get to do what happened. Remember what happened after San Bernardino? For more than a week, there was this push, this desperate push in the media amongst the liberal politicians to say, yeah, nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with Islam. This guy was a repressed closet homosexual who was taking out his revenge on a Latin lover by killing people in that nightclub.
Perfect sense. I get it.
There's reality. It's in your face, but you're going to generate this falsehood that the FBI completely debunked. Look at what happened even later. The transcripts are released by the Department of Justice, in which he tells the 911 dispatcher, as he's mowing down his fellow Americans, I am doing this for the Islamic State. Allah is great. I am a jihadi. I am part of the caliphate. What does DOJ do under the direction of the Attorney General? Deletes or changes any reference to Islam or jihad. When he said in Arabic, Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest, the Department of Justice changed the word Allah to God. Now, you don't get to do that with raw intelligence. That's called the perversion of the intelligence cycle. So rule number one, no politics in the threat assessment, no political correctness, no censorship.
And let me stop you right there, because you wrote that Bush made a huge mistake ignoring the Jordanians and Egyptians' advice of calling jihadism what it was because he didn't want to offend Muslims. And you also said that Saddam Hussein was not a caliphate guy and he wouldn't have used deadly weapons. Did they know this at the time? Like, I get if the public doesn't know it, but what did they know and when did they know it?
Look, I don't want to relitigate the first, operations after 9/11, but the fact is, I'm a bipartisan critic. Obama's policies have been catastrophic, but the Bush administration made some huge errors. The facts are the facts. Saddam Hussein was evil, pure evil. He's the only man in history outside of Adolf Hitler to use chemical weapons on his own population. Just Google, Halabja massacre. So this is a fact. Getting rid of him is a good idea in general because he's evil. But to say I'm getting rid of him because he might give weapons of mass destruction to Al-Qaeda, that's just absurd. There is evidence. You can read the testimony of the amazing Tom Joslin from the Long War Journal. He's testified in front of Congress. There was tactical level assistance. So Saddam Hussein's security services provided tactical level assistance to Al-Qaeda. But the idea that a guy who models himself on Stalin, this is, Saddam Hussein, models himself on a secular dictator, is going to give weapons of mass destruction to a fundamentalist religious jihadi who hates him, not justifiable. As a result, we could take down Saddam Hussein if we justified it on the basis of him being an evil guy. But to justify it on the basis of he's going to give WMD to Al-Qaeda, it's bogus.
Yeah, and I think I just read on your Twitter feed, you posted something about how we shouldn't have been surprised by these bombings. If you're paying attention, you should be expecting this. You wrote in your book that we should have been ready for 9/11. Right. I see a corollary here of the people at the highest head of government. You expect them to understand the things that you're talking about. And that's the point I'm making. Do they or do they not understand it?
They don't and they can't for two big reasons. Number one, they've drunken the Kool-Aid of an analysis about 6.5 years ago that terrorism is the result of poverty and lack of education. This is an article of faith. Terrorism comes from poor people who've been dispossessed, are stupid, uneducated, and are poor. Now, if lack of education and poverty resulted in terrorism, half of India would be terrorists. But they're not. What's missing? It's the thing you can't talk about, the ideology. And you can't talk about the ideology because in this case, it's a religious one. And if you talk about the Islamic ideology of jihadis, you are undermining the one world kumbaya, a relativist, multicultural narrative on which the left is built. So there's this inbred inability to talk about the truth because otherwise it undermines their worldview. And then lastly, there's a kind of bigger philosophical one. The sad truth is that a lot of people on on Capitol Hill in Washington, even on the right, unfortunately, don't take religion seriously. If they say they have faith, they may go to church at the weekend, they may go to temple, but in most cases, they see themselves as a sophisticated, postmodern guy or gal. And for them, going to church or temple is a cool networking tool. Over coffee and donuts afterwards, I'll schmooze. Now, if you don't have personal faith, I realized this about 3 years into the war. I don't care if you're a Buddhist or a Zoroastrian or a Hindu or a Christian, I don't care. But if you don't have faith, if you don't understand the power of the transcendental, you will never understand our enemy. You won't even begin to understand the concept of a suicide bomber. So as a result, we have a political elite that simply cannot understand the stakes of this war and what our enemy believes.
Excellent. And in terms of the philosophy that the followers buy into, something that you talked about in the book, and I've read your articles about the enemy masterminds. And so if I get in an argument with someone who's an atheist, and I say, well, you like Harris and Dawkins, or if they're an Alinskyite because they like, that's Obama and Clinton, you have to look at the people that have intellectually mentored them. So when you talk about Abdullah Hazam and Saeed Gateb, sorry, I'm saying these names wrong, Iman al-Zawahiri, Brigadier General S.K. Malik, if I were to say these names to anyone who hadn't read your book, they would just blank stare. And I imagine that happens in government a lot. Tell us about why it's important to understand the philosophies of the intellectual mentors who are distributing the doctrines of jihad.
Very simply, because Sun Tzu was right. If you want to win a war, you have to know yourself and you have to know your enemy. The jihadists aren't random. They don't just make stuff up as they go along. They follow a game plan. If you go to our war colleges, if you go to West Point, if you go to the Naval Academy, if you go to the War College, What are you going to study? You're going to study the masters of Western military strategy. You're going to study Napoleon, Clausewitz, Mackinder, Boyd, so on and so forth. Well, guess what? The bad guys have their own Clausewitzes, their own Napoleons, and they're the names you mentioned: Qutb, Azam, Malik, and the leaders of Al-Qaeda over the years. These individuals have written books on how to destroy us. And if you don't read them, you don't understand. You don't know what's happening next. And the bad guys have read these books. And if they've read them, you need to read them if you want to defeat them.
What would you give advice in the book when you talk about how in Vietnam we basically measured our success in the war by the body bag count? Let's talk about winning the war against jihad. Let's close out with what us regular citizens do and what's going to happen the next 10 or 20 years, in your opinion, as the expert on the subject.
Right. So we talked about the first leg of the plan. The last two parts, number two, we have to understand this isn't a war with Islam, because remember, what was the religion of the fighter pilot in the cage that was burnt alive? He was a Jordanian Muslim. This is a war inside Islam that is also targeting Christians, Yazidis, Jews, you mention it. But because it's a war inside Islam, who do we want to be the face of it? Not white-skinned or brown-skinned Americans. We want our Muslim allies in the region, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, also the Kurds. We have to help them create a real coalition, not this false Potemkin alliance that the Obama administration keeps talking about, which doesn't exist, a real one. They have to trust us. They don't trust us right now. We have to help them close with and crush the enemy. And the last part, the long-term victory is not, you're absolutely right, it's not measured in body bags, okay? Killing terrorists is great. I'm all down for killing terrorists, but it's a bad metric. Body bags was a stupid metric in Vietnam, not much better a metric today. In the war of the flea, this is what they call it, the irregular war, the kinetic is less than 25%. The larger part of this war is the point at which young men and women don't want to become jihadis. And how do you do that? You destroy their message. You destroy the brand. Just like the Gipper, just like Ronald Reagan destroyed the brand of communism. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. You run an evil empire. We have to do the same thing with jihad today. And of course, again, not people like me, mostly our allies and our partners, assisted by a giant, covert counter-propaganda campaign. That way, we delegitimize the message, fewer people want to become jihadis, and eventually we put a stake through the heart of this new totalitarianism.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! Hell yeah! But I'm a big fan of money. I like it. I use it. I have a little. I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I'd like to put more in that jar. That's where you come in.